April 17, 1964. 3 a.m. 6 black teenagers, handcuffed, blood on their shirts, charged with murder. The problem? They were innocent, completely, provably, documentably innocent. The second problem? In 1964 Harlem, that didn't matter. But here's what did matter. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the most powerful gangster in Harlem, heard about the case, and he made a decision that would bring Malcolm X to the courtroom, the NAACP to the fight, and the national media to a story the NYPD wanted buried. This is the night the wrong arrests changed everything. Before we understand what made the Harlem Six case different, you need to understand what made it exactly the same. Harlem. If you were a young black man walking home after dark, you carried an invisible target on your back. Not metaphorically, literally. The NYPD had a quota system. Arrests meant promotions. Convictions meant commendations. And in a neighborhood where the assumption of guilt came with your skin color, closing cases was easy. Stop, frisk, arrest, charge, convict. The system ran like a machine. Efficient, brutal, legal. Here's how it worked. A crime happens. Witnesses give vague descriptions. Young, black, tall. Officers flood the neighborhood, round up anyone who fits. Someone always confesses. Not because they did it, because after 18 hours in interrogation, after the threats, after the promises, after the exhaustion, signing a paper starts to feel like the only way out. Public defenders, overworked, underpaid, 30 cases each. Maybe they meet their client 5 minutes before trial. Maybe they don't meet them at all. Either way, the outcome is the same. Guilty. And if you're thinking, but what about evidence? What about witnesses? What about rights? You're thinking like someone who believes the system works the way it's supposed to. It didn't. Not for them. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable search and seizure. Beautiful words, constitutional words, words that meant absolutely nothing when the badge knocking on your door assumed you were guilty before asking your name. The Sixth Amendment guarantees the right to counsel. Effective counsel. Counsel that fights for you, but effectiveness requires time, resources, money. 3 things public defenders didn't have. 3 things that made the difference between freedom and prison. This wasn't an accident, this was the design. Arrest quotas created incentives to grab anyone. Overworked defenders created a pipeline to plea deals, and a jury pool that looked nothing like the defendants created verdicts written before the trial began. So when 6 teenagers were arrested on April 17, 1964, charged with the brutal murder of a white shopkeeper, nobody in Harlem was surprised. This was Tuesday. But here's what made this Tuesday different. The teenagers arrested? They weren't just in the wrong place at the wrong time. They weren't even in the right neighborhood. They had alibis, multiple witnesses, proof they were miles away when the murder happened, the kind of proof that, in a functioning system, would have ended the case in 48 hours. Instead, the NYPD held them for a week. No phone calls, no lawyers, no parents allowed in. And when the story finally leaked to the community, the response wasn't resignation, it was rage. Because Harlem in 1964 wasn't the Harlem of 1944. 20 years of migration, organization, and resistance had built something new. The neighborhood had leaders now, activists, lawyers, churches with political power, newspapers that actually covered the community. And it had Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy didn't run numbers anymore, not directly. By 1964, he was 57 years old, semi-retired. The young gangsters coming up were different, meaner. They dealt heroin, something Bumpy had always refused. They didn't protect the neighborhood, they fed on it. But Bumpy still had respect, still had money, still had connections that ran from the street corners to the courtrooms. And when he heard about 6 innocent boys sitting in jail, charged with a murder they didn't commit, while their families couldn't afford lawyers, couldn't afford bail, couldn't afford anything except watching their sons disappear into the system, Bumpy made a phone call. Not to a lawyer, not yet, to Malcolm X. Their names were Wallace Baker, Daniel Hamm, Willie Craig, Walter Thomas, Robert Rice, and Ronald Felder. Ages 14 to 19. Crimes committed, none. The oldest, Wallace Baker, 19, worked at a grocery store, saved money for community college, wanted to be a teacher. His mother had raised him alone after his father died in the war. Every dollar he earned went into a jar, labeled tuition. He was 3 months away from having enough. Daniel Hamm, 16, sang in the church choir. Tenor voice so pure the congregation would go silent when he started. His grandmother, who raised him, told everyone he was going to be the next Sam Cooke. He believed her. Willie Craig, 15, ran track. Fast enough that scouts from high schools in Brooklyn had started coming to meets. Fast enough that his coach told him he had a shot at something bigger. Fast enough that when the police grabbed him, he thought about running, but he didn't. Because running meant guilt, and he wasn't guilty. Walter Thomas, 15, loved science, built a radio from scraps. His teacher submitted his project to a citywide competition. He won 2nd place. The prize was a scholarship opportunity. He was supposed to interview for it the week he got arrested. Robert Rice, 14, the youngest, played stickball on 125th Street every day after school. His dream was to play for the Yankees. He wore his Yankees cap everywhere, even kept it on when the police threw him against the wall, even kept it on in the cell. Someone stole it the second night. Ronald Felder, 17, worked 2 jobs, morning shifts at the docks, evening shifts washing dishes, sent money home to his mother in South Carolina, hadn't seen her in 3 years, was saving for a bus ticket to visit for Christmas. 6 boys, 6 futures, 6 families. And on the night of April 17, 1964, all of it stopped. The crime they were charged with was brutal. A fruit stand owner, Frank Sugar, white, 53 years old, had been stabbed to death during a robbery. Witnesses described 3 young black men running from the scene. Heights varied, descriptions conflicted. But the NYPD had enough. Young, black, Harlem. That was the profile. Wallace, Daniel, Willie, Walter, Robert, and Ronald fit the profile. None of them had been anywhere near the fruit stand. Wallace was at work. His time card proved it. Daniel was at choir practice. The entire congregation saw him. Willie was at track practice. His coach vouched for him. Walter was at the library. The librarian remembered him. Robert was playing stickball. A dozen kids confirmed it. Ronald was at the docks. His supervisor signed an affidavit. Airtight alibis. Didn't matter. The NYPD had a different kind of evidence. Confessions. After 72 hours of interrogation, 4 of the boys signed statements. Not because they were guilty, because they were told that signing meant going home, because they were 14, 15, 16 years old, and they were terrified, because the detectives said their friends had already confessed, so they might as well too. Because sleep deprivation is torture, and torture produces compliance, not truth. Willie Craig never signed, refused for 6 straight days. They beat him for it. When his mother finally saw him a week later, his ribs were broken. His eye was swollen shut. His lips were split. She asked him, "Baby, why didn't you just sign?" He said, "Because I didn't do it." That's when the mothers organized. 6 black women, working class, no money, no connections, no power. Except the power that comes from loving your child more than you fear the system. They went to the churches. The churches mobilized the community. The community went to the Amsterdam News, Harlem's black newspaper. The Amsterdam News ran the story. 6 innocent boys framed by NYPD. The story spread. And that's when Bumpy Johnson walked into Wallace Baker's mother's apartment, sat down at her kitchen table, and said, "How much do you need for a lawyer?" She told him the number. A number she didn't have. A number that represented 6 months of her salary. A number that meant her son would have a public defender who wouldn't fight. Bumpy wrote a check. Then he wrote 5 more. Ellsworth Raymond, Bumpy Johnson, didn't do interviews, didn't make speeches, didn't explain himself. But Mamie Johnson, his wife, did. 40 years after his death, she published a memoir. Harlem Godfather, The Rap on My Husband, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. In it, she described a pattern. Bumpy funding bail for people arrested on bogus charges. Bumpy paying medical bills for families the hospitals turned away. Bumpy covering rent for widows evicted by landlords who knew the law wouldn't protect them. The Harlem Six case wasn't charity. It was what Bumpy did. But this time he didn't just write checks, he made calls. First call to Malcolm X. Malcolm at that point had just left the Nation of Islam, March 1964. He was building something new, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, a movement focused on human rights, international solidarity, and direct action. He needed a cause, a case that would prove the system's brutality, a platform to show why black communities couldn't rely on white institutions for justice. The Harlem Six was perfect. Malcolm agreed to speak publicly about the case, to call it what it was, a legal lynching, to bring national attention, to make it impossible to ignore. Second call to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. The NAACP had resources Harlem didn't. Lawyers trained at Harvard and Yale, experience fighting wrongful convictions, a track record of beating the system in court. But they were selective. They took cases they could win, cases with media attention, cases that mattered. Bumpy's money made the Harlem Six matter. The Legal Defense Fund assigned 2 attorneys, William Kunstler and Conrad Lynn. Both would go on to become legends in civil rights law. Both were known for taking cases nobody else would touch. Both believed the legal system could be forced to deliver justice if you fought hard enough and refused to back down. Kunstler reviewed the case files, the confessions, the alibis, the timeline. His first words, "This is a setup." His second words, "We can win." Third call to the white press. This was the gamble. The Amsterdam News covered the story, but the Amsterdam News reached Harlem. The New York Times reached everyone. The Times could make this national, could force city officials to respond, could turn 6 arrested boys into a constitutional crisis. But the Times didn't cover Harlem stories, not unless they fit a narrative. Gang violence? Yes. Community organizing against injustice? No. Bumpy knew this, so he didn't call the Times asking for coverage. He called in a favor. A reporter he'd helped years ago. A white reporter who'd written a story about Bumpy in 1952, a story that could have destroyed him if it ran one way, but instead ran differently because Bumpy had given him access nobody else had. The reporter owed him. The story ran on page 12. Not front page, but it ran. 6 Harlem youths claim innocence in murder case. 12 sentences, buried between advertisements. But enough, because those 12 sentences included the words, "Lawyers claim police coerced confessions," and "multiple witnesses support alibis." Enough to make other reporters ask questions. Here's what Bumpy understood that most people didn't. The system runs on invisibility. Arrests happen in the dark. Confessions happen behind closed doors. Trials happen in courtrooms where the only audience is the families who can't change the outcome. But if you force visibility, if you bring cameras, reporters, activists, lawyers who know how to fight, the system has to pretend to be fair. It won't be fair, but it has to pretend. And pretending creates cracks. Cracks you can exploit. Bumpy's money didn't buy justice, but it bought visibility. And visibility bought time. Time to investigate, time to organize, time to build a defense that could actually fight. The 6 families didn't understand this yet. All they knew was that a gangster had walked into their kitchens and handed them hope. Later, they would understand the strategy. Later, they would see how every piece Bumpy moved, Malcolm's speeches, the NAACP's lawyers, the media coverage, worked together. Later. For now, they just held on to hope. June 1964. The trial began. Judge Jacob Markowitz, white, 62 years old, known for tough sentencing, known for believing police testimony, known for running a courtroom where defense lawyers didn't get much room to breathe. Prosecutor Frank Hogan's office. Hogan, the Manhattan District Attorney, had a 94% conviction rate. His office didn't bring cases they couldn't win, which meant they weren't planning to lose this one. Defense: William Kunstler and Conrad Lynn. 2 lawyers against an office of 40. 2 lawyers who'd walked into this case knowing the odds. 2 lawyers who didn't care about odds. The prosecution's case was simple. 6 boys, 4 confessions, eyewitnesses who placed young black males near the scene. The defense's case required proving a negative. These specific boys were not there. Here's why that's hard. Proving you were somewhere else requires documentation. Time cards, receipts, witnesses who remember you specifically. In 1964, Harlem, a 15-year-old playing stickball on 125th Street, didn't generate documentation. He just existed. And existing wasn't evidence. But Kunstler had something prosecutors didn't expect: time. Because Bumpy's money meant no plea deals. Public defenders push plea deals. Take the lesser charge. 5 years instead of 20. You'll be out in 3 with good behavior. It's not justice, but it's survival. And when you're poor, survival is the only math that matters. Kunstler didn't need his clients to survive. He needed them free. So he fought. Discovery phase. Kunstler demanded everything. Police reports, interrogation logs, the names of every officer involved, witness statements, all of them, not just the ones the prosecution wanted to use. The prosecution resisted. Irrelevant, immaterial, burdensome. Kunstler filed motions. Judge Markowitz, who could have denied them, didn't. Why? Because Malcolm X was sitting in the gallery. Every single day, front row. And Malcolm wasn't quiet. He called the trial a legal lynching in speeches across Harlem. He wrote articles for Muhammad Speaks and the Amsterdam News. He held press conferences outside the courthouse. He said things like, "This is what they do. They take our children, they beat confessions out of them, they parade them in front of all white juries, and they call it justice." Malcolm wasn't a lawyer, but he was a spotlight, and spotlights make judges nervous. Judge Markowitz allowed the discovery. What Kunstler found: interrogation logs showed the boys had been held for 72 hours before confessing. No parents present, no lawyers present, no sleep. Medical records showed Willie Craig had been hospitalized after his arrest. Broken ribs, contusions consistent with blunt force trauma. The police report said he resisted arrest. The hospital report said he'd been beaten. Witness statements, the original ones before the prosecution cleaned them up, contradicted each other. Heights didn't match. Clothing descriptions didn't match. Even the number of suspects varied from 2 to 5. And the confessions, they weren't written by the boys. They were typed by detectives. 4 identical statements, same language, same sentence structure, same confession, copy-pasted 4 times with different names. Kunstler presented this evidence methodically. Document by document. Contradiction by contradiction. He didn't make speeches. He just let the evidence speak. But evidence alone doesn't win trials. Especially not in 1964. Especially not with an all-white jury. So Kunstler built a narrative. The narrative wasn't, "These boys are innocent. Everyone's innocent until proven guilty." That's the default. The narrative was, the NYPD framed 6 children. Strong word. Framed. But Kunstler proved it. He brought Wallace's time card to the stand. The manager of the grocery store testified. Wallace was working. I saw him. He never left. He brought the choir director. Daniel was at practice. He sang a solo. I remember because it was beautiful. He brought the track coach. Willie ran the 400 meters. He finished 3rd. I have the results right here. He brought the librarian. Walter was researching a project. I helped him find books. I remember him clearly. Alibi after alibi after alibi. And then Kunstler did something brilliant. He called Detective James McCarthy to the stand. McCarthy had led the interrogations. Kunstler asked, "Detective McCarthy, how long did you interrogate Wallace Baker before he confessed?" "I don't recall the exact time." "Was it longer than 24 hours?" "Possibly." "Did his mother ask to see him?" "Yes." "Did you allow it?" "No." "Why not?" "We were in the middle of questioning." "For 72 hours you were in the middle of questioning?" McCarthy didn't answer. Kunstler didn't need him to. The jury had heard enough. August 1964. The verdict, not guilty. All 6 boys, every single charge. The courtroom erupted, families crying, Malcolm X standing, fist raised, reporters rushing to phones to file the story. But here's what the verdict didn't change. The boys had spent 4 months in jail. 4 months of school missed, jobs lost, scholarships gone. Wallace's tuition jar, spent on bail. Daniel's voice, he stopped singing. Willie's track career, over. No scouts came back. Walter's science scholarship interview, he missed it. Robert's Yankees cap, never recovered. Ronald's Christmas visit home, postponed indefinitely because he'd lost both jobs. They were innocent. The jury said so. The system admitted it, but they weren't whole. That's the thing about wrongful arrests. Even when you win, you lose. Wallace never made it to community college. The grocery store didn't hire him back. Too much attention, bad for business. He worked odd jobs for 3 years before getting a factory position. Died in 1998. Never became a teacher. Daniel never sang again. Not in church, not anywhere. His grandmother asked him once why he stopped. He said, "God wasn't listening when I needed him." Willie joined the military in 1966, served in Vietnam, came home with PTSD, struggled with addiction. Clean now, but the track career that could have been, gone. Walter works as a janitor, never finished high school. The science project that won second place sits in his daughter's attic. She doesn't know what it is. Robert never played for the Yankees, drives a bus in Brooklyn, still loves baseball, watches every game. But he doesn't play anymore. Ronald went back to the docks, still sends money to his mother, never got to visit that Christmas. She died in 1972. He wasn't there. 6 innocent boys, acquitted, free but not free. So what did the case actually change? Not NYPD policy. Officers who beat Willie Craig, no charges filed. Detectives who coerced confessions, no discipline. The system that allowed 6 innocent children to be arrested, held, interrogated, and charged with murder based on nothing. Still running exactly the same way. No official policy changed, no law was rewritten, no precedent was set. But something else happened. The case became a symbol. Malcolm X used it in every speech he gave for the next 6 months. The Harlem Six. Remember their names. Remember what this system tried to do to them. And remember that it's only because we organized, because we fought, because we refused to accept their version of justice that those boys are free. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund used the case as proof that wrongful convictions could be beaten, could be fought, could be exposed. They trained lawyers on the tactics Kunstler used: discovery demands, medical evidence, alibi building. The case showed Harlem that resistance worked. Not perfectly, not completely, not enough, but it worked. And in 1964, when the Civil Rights Act passed, when Harlem was watching Mississippi and Alabama and thinking about what freedom actually meant, the Harlem Six case was evidence that fighting the system locally could win. Small victory. Insufficient victory, but victory. Here's the bitter part. 60 years later, we're still fighting the same battle. Breonna Taylor. Killed in a no-knock raid. Wrong apartment. Innocent. Dead. The Central Park Five. Coerced confessions. Wrongfully convicted. 5 years stolen. Khalif Browder. Arrested at 16. Held at Rikers for 3 years without trial. Charges eventually dropped. Killed himself 2 years later. The pattern hasn't changed, we just have more cameras now. So no, the Harlem Six case didn't change NYPD policy. But it changed what Harlem believed was possible. And sometimes, belief is the only thing you've got to work with. So why did Bumpy Johnson fund the defense of 6 boys he'd never met? Here's what Mamie Johnson said in her memoir. Bumpy believed that if you had power and didn't use it to protect your community, then you were just another leech. He said the numbers game, the gambling, all of it, that was business. But business meant nothing if the neighborhood fell apart. Because once the neighborhood falls, the business falls too. Bumpy wasn't a hero. He ran an illegal gambling operation. He'd killed people, not many, not indiscriminately, but enough that his reputation was built on violence as much as respect. He'd served time in Alcatraz. He'd broken laws his entire adult life. But he had a code. That code said, you don't sell heroin, ever. Heroin destroys communities, and destroying your own community is suicide. That code said, You don't hurt civilians, period. The cops, the rival gangs, the people trying to take your business, fine. But the grandmother walking to church, the kid playing stickball, the shopkeeper minding his business, untouchable. That code said, you protect your own. And your own meant Harlem, all of Harlem. Because the moment Harlem stopped trusting you, stopped seeing you as one of them, you lost the only power that mattered. The cops hated Bumpy, arrested him constantly, tried to run him out of Harlem for 30 years, but they couldn't, because every time they arrested him, someone made bail. Every time they charged him, he had lawyers. Every time they raided his operations, they found nothing, because the neighborhood warned him first. The neighborhood protected him, because he protected them. The Harlem Six case was that protection in action. But it wasn't purely altruistic. Bumpy understood something the NYPD didn't. Wrongful arrests radicalize communities. Every innocent boy arrested is a family turned against the system. Every beating is a story that spreads. Every coerced confession is proof that the law isn't justice, it's violence with paperwork. And radicalized communities destabilize neighborhoods. Destabilized neighborhoods draw federal attention. Federal attention means crackdowns. Crackdowns hurt business. So when Bumpy funded the Harlem Six defense, he was protecting 6 boys, yes, but he was also protecting Harlem's stability, protecting his business, protecting his power. Cynical? Maybe. But the result was the same. 6 innocent boys went free. Here's the question that haunts this story. If the system fails to protect innocent people, and a criminal steps in to do what the law won't, who's the real criminal? Bumpy broke laws, ran illegal gambling, used violence when he thought it was necessary, profited from an underground economy built on the fact that legal economies excluded black people. But the NYPD? They broke innocent children, coerced confessions through torture, manufactured evidence, operated a justice system that presumed guilt based on skin color. Did all of it legally, so which is worse? Illegal protection or legal violence? There's no clean answer. Bumpy wasn't a civil rights leader, wasn't marching with Martin Luther King, wasn't preaching nonviolence. He was a gangster who calculated that protecting his community served his interests, but in a system that abandoned black communities entirely, maybe a gangster with a code was better than a legal system without one. Malcolm X understood this. That's why he showed up to the trial, not because he endorsed Bumpy's lifestyle, but because he recognized that when the system fails, people create their own systems, and sometimes those systems are illegal. And sometimes they're the only thing standing between a community and complete destruction. Bumpy Johnson said Bumpy never talked about the Harlem Six case after it ended. Never mentioned the money he spent. Never took credit. She asked him once why he helped. He said, "'Cause nobody else was going to." That's it. No philosophy, no grand speech, just a simple recognition that if you have the power to stop an injustice and you don't use it, then you're complicit. Bumpy Johnson died on July 7, 1968. Heart attack. Outside Wells Restaurant on 135th Street and 7th Avenue. He was 62 years old. Thousands attended his funeral, packed the streets, lined up for blocks. The police didn't come. They stayed away. Because even in death, Bumpy had more respect in Harlem than they ever would. If you asked a white New Yorker in 1964 who Bumpy Johnson was, you'd get one answer: dangerous criminal, gangster, racketeer, the man who runs Harlem's underworld. If you asked someone from Harlem, you'd get 20 different answers. Mrs. Sarah Mitchell, who ran a beauty parlor on 125th Street, said, "Bumpy Johnson saved my business. Bank wouldn't give me a loan. Landlord was doubling my rent. I was going to lose everything. Bumpy showed up one day, gave me the money I needed, told me to pay him back whenever I could. No interest, no threats, just help." Reverend James Powell, pastor at Abyssinian Baptist Church, said, "I didn't approve of what Bumpy did. Gambling is a sin. Violence is a sin. But when church members came to me because they couldn't afford food, couldn't afford medicine, couldn't afford funerals, I sent them to Bumpy because he helped, and the banks didn't. The government didn't. Bumpy did." Officer Robert Murphy, one of the few black officers in the NYPD at the time, said years later, We were supposed to arrest Bumpy Johnson. That was the job. But every cop in Harlem knew that if Bumpy went down, the neighborhood would explode. He kept the peace. We didn't like it, but we needed it. Teenagers playing basketball on the courts near St. Nicholas Park said, "Bumpy Johnson told us to stay in school, told us not to join gangs, told us that if we messed up, if we hurt somebody in the neighborhood, he'd handle it personally. We believed him, so we stayed out of trouble." 20 different answers. Same truth. Bumpy was complicated. Here's what white America didn't understand. Harlem in the 1960s existed in a paradox. Legally, black Americans had rights. Constitutionally, they were citizens. But functionally, they were excluded from every legitimate institution. Banks redlined black neighborhoods, wouldn't give mortgages, wouldn't give business loans, wouldn't give car loans. Too risky. Employers hired black workers last and fired them first, paid them less for the same work, denied promotions, not qualified. Police arrested black men at 5 times the rate of white men for the same crimes. Patrolled black neighborhoods like occupying armies. Beat, harassed, intimidated, maintaining order. Hospitals turned away black patients. Schools underfunded black students. Housing projects warehoused black families in deteriorating buildings the city refused to maintain. Every legal institution said, "You don't belong here." So what do when the legal economy shuts you out? You build an illegal one. The numbers game, Harlem's lottery, employed thousands, runners, collectors, bankers. It circulated money within the community. It funded businesses banks wouldn't touch. It paid for weddings, funerals, medical bills, rent. Was it illegal? Yes. Was it necessary? Also yes, and Bumpy Johnson controlled it, which meant he controlled the money that kept Harlem alive. That's why the community protected him, not because they loved criminals, but because the legal economy had abandoned them, and Bumpy's illegal economy fed their families. Here's the moral complexity nobody wants to sit with. Bumpy's money came from gambling. Gambling is exploitative. Poor people spending money they don't have on a game they'll almost certainly lose. It's predatory. But that money also funded the Harlem Six defense, kept Mrs. Mitchell's beauty parlor open, paid for funerals when families couldn't, covered rent when landlords evicted. So is that money dirty or clean? Both, and neither. And the question itself might be the wrong question. Because in a system that refuses to provide legitimate pathways to survival, people create illegitimate ones, and then we judge them for it. Judge them for not using resources they were never given access to in the first place. Bumpy Johnson wasn't a saint. Harlem didn't think he was. They knew what he was. They knew what he did. But they also knew that when the Harlem Six were arrested, when 6 innocent boys were facing life in prison, the system didn't help. The NAACP helped. Malcolm X helped, William Kunstler helped, but Bumpy paid for it. And in Harlem, that counted for something. Malcolm X and Bumpy Johnson were not friends. They knew each other. Impossible not to in Harlem. They'd been in the same rooms, attended the same funerals, navigated the same streets, but they operated in different worlds. Malcolm was Nation of Islam. Then, after March 1964, he was something new. Building the Organization of Afro-American Unity, focused on human rights, international solidarity, political action. Bumpy was streets, numbers, power that came from economics, not ideology. But the Harlem Six case brought them together. Here's what Malcolm said in a speech at the Audubon Ballroom on June 28, 1964. "They take our children off the streets, they beat them in interrogation rooms where no witnesses can see. They force confessions out of broken boys who just want to go home to their mothers, and then they parade them in front of all white juries and call it justice. This is not justice. This is a legal lynching, and we will not stand for it." That speech wasn't abstract. Malcolm was talking about the Harlem Six, specifically, by name. He continued, "The Harlem Six are innocent, completely innocent, and everyone knows it. The police know it, the prosecutors know it, the judge knows it, but they're going to try to convict them anyway. Because that's what this system does. It doesn't seek truth, it seeks convictions. And in America, convicting black boys is easy." Malcolm attended the trial every single day he was in New York. Front row, taking notes, writing articles. He wrote in Muhammad Speaks, "The Harlem Six case is proof that we cannot trust white institutions to deliver justice. We must create our own institutions, our own courts, our own systems, because their systems were designed to destroy us." But here's the nuance. Malcolm didn't fund the defense. He didn't have the money. The Organization of Afro-American Unity was new, small, broke. Malcolm's power came from his voice, his platform, his ability to mobilize, not from his bank account. Bumpy had the bank account. So they formed an alliance. Unspoken, unplanned, but effective. Bumpy paid the lawyers. Malcolm brought the spotlight. Together they made the case impossible to ignore. The white press called it radical agitation. The NYPD called it interference. The families called it the only reason our boys came home. Here's what made the alliance work. Malcolm understood that visibility creates accountability. Cameras in the courtroom meant judges had to pretend to be fair. Reporters asking questions meant prosecutors couldn't bury evidence. Public speeches meant the community stayed engaged, stayed angry, stayed mobilized. Bumpy understood that visibility requires resources. Lawyers aren't free. Investigators cost money. Bail bonds aren't posted with speeches. So Malcolm spoke. Bumpy paid. And William Kunstler fought. Three very different men, three very different motivations, one case. And it worked. But the alliance went deeper than the trial. In his autobiography, Malcolm wrote about Harlem's underground economy. He didn't endorse it, but he understood it. He wrote, "When the white man's economy excludes you, when his banks won't lend to you, when his employers won't hire you, when his system treats you as less than human, you create your own economy. It's not legal, but survival isn't always legal." Malcolm was talking about Bumpy without naming him, because Malcolm recognized something the white civil rights movement didn't want to acknowledge. Respectability politics had limits. You could march peacefully, you could sit at lunch counters, you could boycott buses, you could register to vote, and you should. But while you were doing that, you still needed to eat, still needed rent money, still needed to survive. The numbers game wasn't noble, but it was survival. And Malcolm, who'd lived in Harlem, who'd seen how the system worked, understood that judging people for surviving was a luxury only the comfortable could afford. After Malcolm was assassinated in February 1965, Bumpy attended the funeral. He didn't speak, didn't draw attention. Just stood in the back and paid his respects. Mamie Johnson said, "Bumpy cried that day," only time she ever saw him cry. Because Malcolm had been one of the few people who understood what Bumpy understood, the system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed, and survival required building something else. So here we are, 60 years later. 6 boys arrested, 6 boys proven innocent, 6 boys freed. But 6 lives derailed, 6 futures altered, 6 families traumatized. A gangster funded their defense, a revolutionary gave them a voice. 2 lawyers fought a system designed to crush them, and the system itself, unchanged. The officers who beat Willie Craig were never charged. The detectives who coerced confessions were never disciplined. The prosecutors who pursued a case they knew was false faced no consequences. Judge Markowitz retired with full pension. Frank Hogan's office continued winning cases at 94%. The NYPD continued making arrests in Harlem based on profiles, assumptions, quotas. Nothing changed, except this: the Harlem Six walked free. And that mattered. Not enough, but it mattered. Here's the question I can't stop thinking about. Who was the criminal in this story? The boys who were arrested? Innocent, proven in court. The police who beat them? Legal. Qualified immunity protected them. The prosecutors who ignored evidence? Legal. Prosecutorial immunity protected them. Bumpy Johnson, who funded the defense? Illegal. Gambling racketeer. So the only person who acted illegally to produce justice was the criminal. And the people who acted legally to produce injustice were the law. What do you do with that? William Kunstler spent the rest of his career defending people the system wanted to destroy. He represented the Chicago 7, the Attica prison rioters, Native American activists. He died in 1995, still fighting. Conrad Lynn continued civil rights work until his death in 1995. He wrote a memoir called There Is a Fountain. In it, he said the Harlem Six case taught him that the law was a tool, and like any tool, it could be used to build or to destroy. Malcolm X was assassinated less than a year after the Harlem Six verdict, February 21, 1965. He was 39 years old. Bumpy Johnson died 3 years later, July 7, 1968. The same year Martin Luther King was assassinated. The same year Robert Kennedy was assassinated. The same year the world seemed to be tearing itself apart. And the Harlem Six, they lived, survived, carried the weight of those 4 months in jail for the rest of their lives. Daniel Hamm gave an interview in 1966. The interviewer asked him if he was angry about what happened. He said, "Angry? I was angry for about a month. Then I realized being angry wasn't going to change anything. The system doesn't care if you're angry. It just keeps running." That's the truth nobody wants to hear. The system doesn't break because one case goes right. It doesn't reform because one jury delivers the correct verdict. It doesn't stop because we expose its failures. It just keeps running. So what's the point? The point is this. Every single time someone fights back and wins, even a small win, even an insufficient win, it proves that fighting is possible. The Harlem Six could have taken plea deals, could have accepted 5 years instead of 20, could have survived and called it a victory. They didn't. Their families could have given up when they couldn't afford lawyers, could have accepted that this is just how the system works. They didn't. Bumpy could have kept his money. Malcolm could have focused on national issues. Kunstler could have taken easier cases. They didn't. And 6 boys went home. Not whole, not unchanged, not unharmed, but home. That's the point. Not that the system works, but that resistance can still win. Not always, not often enough, not permanently, but sometimes, and sometimes is all you need to keep fighting. April 17, 1964. 6 boys arrested. March 13, 2020. Breonna Taylor killed in a no-knock raid. Wrong information, wrong apartment, innocent dead, 60 years apart. Same system. The Harlem Six lived because people fought for them, because Bumpy paid, because Malcolm spoke, because Kunstler litigated, because the community refused to accept the NYPD's version of events. Breonna Taylor died because no-knock warrants are still legal, because police can break down doors based on outdated information, because qualified immunity protects officers who kill innocent people, because the system that failed the Harlem Six is still running, still making the same mistakes, still calling them mistakes instead of design. Here's what changed between 1964 and 2020. We have cameras now, body cameras, cell phone cameras, doorbell cameras. We have social media. We have hashtags. We have movements. Here's what didn't change. Innocent people still die, still get arrested, still get charged, still get convicted. The tools of resistance improved. The need for resistance remained. So what do? We remember the Harlem Six. We remember that resistance worked. We remember that a gangster, a revolutionary, and 2 lawyers built a coalition that the system couldn't ignore. We remember that justice doesn't come from institutions that were designed to deny it. Justice comes from people who refuse to accept injustice. And we ask ourselves the same question Harlem asked in 1964. If the system fails to protect us, what do we build instead? The numbers game was illegal, but it funded defense for innocent boys when legal institutions wouldn't. Malcolm X was considered dangerous, but he gave voice to families the media ignored. Bumpy Johnson was a criminal. But he paid for justice when the justice system demanded money nobody had. So were they wrong, or was the system wrong? Both can be true. Bumpy's money came from exploitation. Malcolm's rhetoric was radical. The underground economy hurt people even as it helped them. But the legal economy abandoned Harlem entirely. The legal justice system arrested innocent children. The legal institutions failed so completely that illegal alternatives became necessary. That's the paradox we still haven't resolved. We want to believe that working within the system is always the right answer, that incremental change through legal channels is the only moral path, that anything outside the law is automatically wrong. But what do you do when the law itself is the problem? The Fourth Amendment says no unreasonable searches, but it still happens. The Sixth Amendment says right to counsel. But public defenders are still overwhelmed, underfunded, unable to fight. The 14th Amendment says equal protection, but the system still presumes guilt based on skin color. So we have constitutional rights, and we have constitutional reality. And the gap between them is filled with people like the Harlem Six, people like Breonna Taylor, people like Khalif Browder, who spent 3 years at Rikers without trial and killed himself 2 years after being released. The gap is filled with bodies and speeches about how the system needs reform, and reports about how the system failed, and promises about how the system will change, and then more bodies. The Harlem Six survived because people refused to wait for the system to fix itself. They built an alternative. Imperfect, insufficient, temporary, but it worked. That's the lesson. Not that gangsters are heroes, not that illegal economies are solutions, not that we should abandon institutions entirely, but that when institutions fail, people create alternatives. And sometimes those alternatives are the only thing standing between a community and complete destruction. The question isn't whether Bumpy Johnson was a criminal. He was. The question is, in a system that criminalizes survival, who gets to define crime? And until we answer that, we'll keep having more Harlem Six cases, more Breonna Taylors, more families asking, where is justice? And more people learning what Harlem learned in 1964. Sometimes justice doesn't come from the law. Sometimes it comes from people who refuse to obey it.